Okay.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Erin Griffin. I'm the Youth Climate Program Manager at the Wild Center.
And I'm Nadia Harvey. I'm the Education Program Manager at the Finger Lakes Institute, which is part of Hobart and William Smith Colleges.
And thank you for joining us today for a training on how to connect your students to the UN climate change negotiations that are happening in Scotland coming up in a couple weeks. We're really excited to walk through this with you and figure out how you can connect your students to something that's like big and kind of hard to define. So thanks for joining us. I know it's no small feat to hop on a Zoom at the end of a school day, so we all really appreciate everyone who's here today. We know it's no small thing. So our agenda for today is just to get a sense of who you are, kind of share a little bit about who we are, and then we're going to dive into it. What is COP26? Walk through the nuts and bolts of what that is, talk through how youth are involved in COP26, and then walk through some specific resources and curriculum that exist that you can use in your classrooms to connect your students to this, and then walk through how to follow the Wild Center's youth delegation at COP26. So first, before we go into that, we'd love to get a sense of who everyone is joining us today. So if you could head over to menti.com, and you can either do this on a different tab in your browser. If you have Zoom in full screen, hit escape, and then you can open another tab in your browser, or you can do it on your phone. You can open up a browser on your phone, head over to menti.com, and then use code 34158810. And I'm going to put that in the chat too. 34158810. And oops. So first, we just want to get a sense of where everyone is joining from. I think we have a lot of New York teachers here, but I think there also might be some folks from across the country. So put in, if you could enter where you're joining from. Awesome, we have someone from Virginia. That's the farthest away at this point. Welcome. And a couple New York teachers. Looks like some folks down in the Finger Lakes area. Rochester, Clinton, nice.
Could you just say the code again? I can't see it.
Yes, absolutely. It's 341588.
341588.
Yep. 8810.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Awesome. We have Canton, some more Geneva folks. Someone put in the chat they're from Clayton. Ontario, Canada. Excellent. Corning. Awesome. Del Mar, I think we have most areas of New York State covered, so that's pretty exciting. Excellent. So I'm going to change it to the next question. And if you missed this, don't worry. You can always say hi in the chat at any time. So we're going to switch to what best describes you. I know we have a lot of teachers here, but we'd love to see more specifically what kind of teacher, if you're teaching high school or middle school, elementary school, or maybe you're an informal educator. Excellent. So we have some high school teachers, middle school, a couple informal educators. Excellent. Yeah, we were guessing that would be mostly high school teachers. So that seems like that's definitely the case. If anyone figures out how to describe COP26 to elementary school students, let me know. Excellent. And then the last question we have is, what questions do you have about COP26? We know it can be a really challenging thing to understand. There's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of acronyms, and it's a big international policy process through the UN. So it can be difficult to follow. So I'd love to hear what questions you have, or maybe you're not sure yet, and that's totally fine too. Seems like maybe people don't know yet. Maybe you'll have questions as we go along. How can I use information about COP in the classroom? How do I make it relevant? That's a huge one. I think that's one of the biggest questions about COP26 is like, what does it mean for me and my neighbors and the students in my classroom? How will students be heard? Yep. How will youth voice be integrated in the process? I don't have questions because I don't know about it yet. I was there like a month ago, so I totally understand that. Excellent. What recommendations do you have for pre-assignments, reading, podcasts, videos that can be used to introduce it to students? Excellent. We have a lot of those coming your way. Is Greta going to be there? Greta Thunberg, I think she is. I'm pretty sure. I don't know if anyone's been following what she's been doing in lead up to COP, but I've been a fan. She's letting it rip. Okay, well, this is just the beginning. So if you have questions as we go, please put them in the chat as we go along, and we will have time to answer them at the end. So thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from. It really helps us get a sense of who we're talking to in the virtual world when we can't see all of you in person. Okay, so I'm just going to transition a little bit into who we are. So I work at the Wild Center, which is a museum in the Adirondacks up in Tupper Lake, New York. And it's a real interactive mashup of a museum, nature center, aquarium, zoo, kind of all of those things together in one. And we're all the way up here in the center of the Adirondacks. And out of the Wild Center is the Youth Climate Program. And we work around the globe to convene and empower young people to implement climate change solutions and climate action plans in their schools and communities. And we do a ton of different programs for youth and teachers, but the real heart of the Youth Climate Program are Youth Climate Summits, which are events that bring high schoolers together to learn about climate change and create climate action plans. And we've been hosting one at the Wild Center since 2009. But one of the cool things about this work is it's not just here in the Adirondacks, it's not just in the Finger Lakes, it's around the whole world. So there are over 45 locations around the world that have held a Youth Climate Summit based on the model that we started at the Wild Center a long time ago. So summits have been held in Finland and Sri Lanka and Germany and many states across the country and Canada as well. We've had a couple summits in Canada in the last year. So it's something that's open for everyone to kind of look into and start in their own community if they want to.
Great. So I became involved with the Wild Center through the Youth Climate Summit because we started hosting one here in 2017. And this is a picture of the Hobart and William Smith colleges. I'm actually located at the Finger Lakes Institute, and we're involved in research, education, and outreach about water quality of our 11 beautiful Finger Lakes and the watersheds that surround them. So, we're really excited to be connected through the Youth Climate Summit movement and participating in this.
Thanks, Nadia. So we're going to jump in at this point to what is COP26, just the basics, the nuts and bolts of what it is. Mm-hmm. And like I said before, please feel free to enter any of your questions in the chat as we go. I'm hoping that everyone will have a lot of questions. So first of all, we know COP26 is about international climate change policy. Like that's the content of all of this. So why is international climate change policy really important right now? We know climate change is a global problem and it affects all of us. It affects some of us more than others. And it's also urgent. According to the UN, we have until 2030 to make drastic cuts in emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So at this point, because we know it's global, because we know it's urgent, we also know that addressing climate change requires all of us. It requires every person and every nation and every government. And so because the problem is so large, we know that international climate negotiations have to be part of the solution, or we won't be able to reach this global agreement that will allow us to make really drastic cuts across the globe. So that's kind of the basis of all of this, is we're at this point right now where we need international agreement and action on climate in order to get to where we need to go. So as we get into it, just a heads up, it's like impossible to talk about COP without using jargon. Like the name COP26 doesn't even really mean anything. So we're going to do the best that we can to break everything down into understandable terms. But this is just your heads up and warning that jargon comes with the territory when you're talking about the governing bodies of the UN. So that's your advance warning. So first of all, the first player in all of this is the UNFCCC, acronym number 1. So that stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's an international environmental treaty to address climate change. It has no enforcement or binding greenhouse gas emission reductions. So this was adopted in 1994 by 197 countries. And the countries are also called parties, which will be important later. So this framework of the UNFCCC does provide opportunities for the countries or parties to create treaties, and these treaties are typically called protocols or agreements. So this is kind of like the framework umbrella under which all of this is happening. So that's the first acronym you'll hear about quite a bit, the UNFCCC.
And can I jump in for just a second? Yes. I wanted to just mention for everyone who's listening, we are going to send out these slides. So if you're trying to furiously write every detail down, we'll share it. And also we're recording the session.
Awesome. Thanks, Nadia. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so UNFCCC. So moving on. So since 1995, all of the parties or countries of the UNFCCC have met annually to check in on how global climate action progress is going. They're kind of taking stock of what's happening to deal with climate change. So these meetings are called the Conference of the Parties, or COP. So that's what COP means in all of this, is a conference of the parties. And this is an annual culmination of a year of work. It happens, all the work is happening throughout the year, and everyone comes together once a year to check in on what's happening. So COPs happen in a different country every year, rotates around the globe. And even though it's called the Conference of the Party, it's not a type of party with balloons or cake or anything like that. It's more like this type of party, not exactly as much fun. So what's happening at these annual COPs are tracking on goals, the goals that the different countries come up with to address climate action, climate change, and kind of evaluating on the progress that they've made. And every year, a COP presents different opportunities and different challenges. The COPs are a little bit different depending on what country they're in, but they will have characteristics that are similar across all the countries. So for example, it's similar to any large conference that has plenary sessions and exhibits and different sessions that participants can attend on all sorts of different topics relating to climate change. But parallel to all of that, there are negotiations and discussions between all of the country representatives on the details of how to develop and revise and implement the different agreements. So these are the different treaties that the countries are coming up with. So delegates from civil society, the UN calls any citizen someone from civil society. And so delegates play a really important role at the COPs in terms of advocating for specific targets, advocating for different solutions, particularly on behalf of their constituents, of the people in their country and what people in their country think is important. And then just raising the capacity of governments to make this work happen. Like the governments can't do it alone. The people of all these different countries have to be involved as well. So the most recent major outcome of a COP that most people have heard of or remember is the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2018. So it's about 3 years old at this point. And this is the very first agreement set through the UNFCCC, that like big overarching umbrella framework. The Paris Agreement sets a framework for setting greenhouse gas reduction goals and evaluating progress and ratcheting up those targets over time. So that's the first real agreement with teeth that's come out of a COP, essentially, and that was only 3 years ago. So the goals of the Paris Agreement are to limit global temperature increase to less than 2 degrees Celsius and to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. The second goal is to enhance resilience and adaptation to climate impacts that we know are going to occur and are already occurring. And then last, money has to come from somewhere to pay for all of these adaptation and mitigation efforts. And so to align the financial flows in the world in a way that will actually fund this work to make it happen. So that's the Paris Agreement. That's a really important step in the work that's happened from all of these COPs. So, jargon alert, I told you it was going to happen. Here it is. In preparation for the Paris Agreement, each individual country was asked to submit something called the INDC. And the INDC is an intended nationally determined contribution. And essentially that is what the country is committing to do to address climate change. How much do they think they can reduce their greenhouse gases? That's all that is. So it is really important because there is a lot of challenges and disagreements that come up around how much each country should contribute to addressing climate change. And it comes down to this, the INDCs. So these are all voluntary as part of the Paris Agreement when they're an INDC. And then, so the Paris Agreement is voluntary. And that is one of the reasons why that agreement was able to be reached, because it was voluntary. Past attempts for more binding agreements didn't go well because they were binding. So once a country formally has signed on to the Paris Agreement, their INDC becomes an NDC. It's just a nationally determined contribution. It's how much they're committing, that country is committing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So discussions at the past couple of COPs have been centered around the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Like, okay, we set these goals, and now what kind of mechanisms are we going to put in place to make sure these goals are reached? So that brings us up to, drum roll, COP26. Here we are. So COP26 was scheduled to happen last year, December 2020 in Glasgow, Scotland, but it was postponed because of COVID. And now it's happening in November 2021. It's starting in about two and a half weeks in Glasgow, Scotland. And it's really been touted as the last chance we have globally to really accelerate climate change action to avoid the worst of climate change impacts. Like, it's COP26, we've been doing this for 26 years. Like, it's really time to get some effort and urgency behind some of this. So it definitely feels like there's a lot at stake this year at COP26. So the 4 main goals of COP26 are to secure net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So what does that mean? Net zero refers to the balance between the amount of greenhouse gases we're producing and then the amount removed from the atmosphere. When we reach net zero, or we reach net zero when the amount we add is no more than the amount taken out of the atmosphere. And then 1.5 degrees Celsius is widely agreed upon to be the upper maximum limit of temperature rise that we can have before catastrophic impacts start to kick in. And the Earth has already warmed about 0.5 degrees Celsius since the mid-1970s when global warming really accelerated. So that's the first goal. And the second one is to adapt to impacts from climate change to protect communities and habitats. And that also includes protecting and restoring ecosystems, building resilient infrastructure, and adopting resilient agricultural practices. I could go into all of these, but we'd be here all day. So I'm just going to kind of breeze over them. Third is to mobilize finance, like I was saying before. So they are shooting for developed countries to mobilize at least 100 billion in climate finance per year by 2030. That should say 2030. And the last one is to work together to deliver on these goals. And it sounds kind of vague, but it's necessary. Like the countries need to work together to make all of this happen. So they need to finalize the Paris rule book, which are all of the rules in place that countries have to follow to meet the goals. So it's a big job, and they can't do it without working together. And then the last thing I just want to bring up about COP that's really important is there are some deep inequities throughout the process that we just can't ignore. The impacts of climate change are not felt equally, and they tend to exacerbate existing inequalities in systems. So if a country or community is already struggling from some sort of societal issue, whether that's poverty or hunger or racism or lack of access to education, climate change will make that worse. So some countries literally have their very existence at stake from climate change. The photo here is of officials in the Maldives, an island nation off the coast of India, and they're staging an underwater meeting to show that their entire country will disappear from sea level rise if urgent action is not taken. So it's hard to imagine a COP taking place without including and prioritizing folks like these that literally have their entire countries at stake from climate change. And as you can imagine, COVID has only made all of this worse. Some countries don't have access to vaccines, or maybe they can't afford the cost of quarantining in a hotel in Scotland prior to attending COP, which many countries are required to do because the COVID rates in their countries are high because they don't have access to vaccines. And so there's major concern that many countries from the global south will not be able to attend due to these barriers. So I just bring this up because I think we all need to understand that this whole process of COP models a lot of the inequities that have created climate change in the first place. And we can't really work towards equitable solutions until we understand how the system works and how it advantages some folks over others. So those are just some underlying issues that have really been in the news in lead up to COP. So I hope that helped understand some of the nuts and bolts. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nadia, who's going to talk about the Conference of Youth and some of the ways that youth are involved with the COP process.
Thanks, Erin. So I think it's really important for the young people that you're working with to understand that youth are involved in this process and that there is an opportunity for youth voices to be heard. So prior to COP26, the 16th Conference of Youth, so COP26, another acronym, will be meeting in Glasgow, October 28th through 31st. And COP26 is going to convene youth representatives from 140 nations to develop a global youth statement that will be submitted to COP26. And so this is something that's really part of the process and has been going on since 2005. So next slide. And there's another term as far as jargon goes that you're going to hear a little bit about. It's called Youngo in the policy team. So Youngo is the Children and Youth Constituency to the UNFCCC. This group has held official observer status to the climate change negotiations since 2011. And the goal is to ensure that the perspectives of youth and future generations are taken into account in the decision-making process. So any of the outcomes that are presented and agreed upon have a youth perspective. Next slide, please. So what are the goals and the outcomes for COP26? The first goal is the most substantial output for COP26, and that's coming up with a position paper or policy document that will represent the voice of youth in the UN climate negotiations. So this is something that they will develop with input from stakeholders and youth from throughout the globe, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that's done in just a second. The second goal is capacity building. The delegates attend a series of plenary and breakout sessions with topics on how climate change affects different sectors and industries. So a lot of information and knowledge acquisition for the the COP26 delegates. The third is skills building. So the participants at COP26 will attend other workshops that build skills such as pitching, fundraising, event management, youth mobilization, and public speaking. And then lastly, because we have so many different nations represented, 140 different nations are going to be at COP26. The social events and networking activities are really geared towards cultural exchange and learning about different cultures and practices across the participants. And you can see here the different social media platforms that are going to be used by COP26. So you can follow those or share that with your students to follow themselves. Something that's also really interesting is on the COP26 website, there was a link where interested young folks could apply to become a delegate. And that's something for your students to think about in the future. If they become very interested in these types of negotiations, there are opportunities for young people to apply to participate as well. Okay, next one. Okay, so how is the youth statement involved here or developed? So there's an input flow chart here that's pretty general, but it really shows the different areas that the youth are getting input from. So different sectors include schools, organizations, institutions of higher learning, educational outreach groups like a lot of us represent here, and the community. And so each different nation has youth delegates that are responsible for generating input from their own country. The way the US did this was through a Google form. It was very informal. You could submit comments individually, or they had a process where organizations could actually create a formal position paper, and they have steps that are very detailed that go through that process. So each nation representative brings their feedback and input to their synthesized and summarized input to COP26, and then they share that information together as their delegation come up with their position paper. And then that goes to Youngo, which then is formally elevated to COP26. So it's a really interesting process. There's a lot of work that happens in the months leading up to COP26 and COP26, which Erin also alluded to, that just because the negotiations are happening in November doesn't mean that these tasks haven't been, moving forward. There's been a lot of work that has gone on, and there's a really great website. It was included on the first slide for COP26, and it's definitely worth checking out to get more information. Next slide, I think. We are at the point here in our presentation where we're really excited to be introducing somebody who's going to be a youth delegate at COP26. So Andrew Fagerheim is a sophomore at Columbia University. He's also formerly part of the Homer Youth Climate Summit, and he's on the Wild Center's Youth Advisory Board. So Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few minutes here to share some of your perspectives. And I think I have to unmute you. There you go.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Nadia and Erin. It's great to be here with all of you. I appreciate the opportunity to also get a refresher on COP and COI, because there's a lot of jargon, and to be able to share some of my thoughts as well. A little bit about myself. As Nadia mentioned, I am currently at Columbia University, and I graduated from Homer High School in the central New York area. I got involved in youth climate work through the Wild Center, and I really appreciated their model of using education as a pathway to climate education. And that's why using education as a pathway to climate action, excuse me. So that's why I think the work that, that all of you do is so important and vital. And I'm really glad to be here with a group of educators. I helped found the Central New York Youth Climate Summit after attending the Adirondack Youth Climate Summit, which Nadia presented at, and we were really happy to have her experience a few years ago. We also worked on a number of different projects at our school to get a garden and a greenhouse and a solar charging station. And then we started working with our local government, the Village of Homer, on the Climate Smart Communities program, which is a New York State program that provides support and recognition for local governments in the state that are taking on climate change. So I've been really fortunate to have experience at the local and regional levels of climate action. And I'm really looking forward to attending COP in 2.5 weeks because it's an opportunity to network at a global level, to share best practices with other youth in particular who will be attending the conference, and to advocate for both climate education and youth voices is two really important factors in climate solutions, and to really accelerating our climate action around the globe. The goal of our delegation at the Wild Center and other delegations we've partnered with is to make these talks that can often seem distant, especially to the rural students in the areas that we come from at the Finger Lakes Institute and the Wild Center. Our goal is to make these talks more relevant and accessible to a broader audience. And hopefully bring back some of the really encouraging models and stories from around the world that we're able to see and engage with. So yeah, those are the things that I'm most looking forward to. And I think I'll pass it back to Nadia and Erin.
Thanks, Andrew. So having a youth delegation and a delegation from the Wild Center was one of our inspirations for hosting this kind of event today. So we could connect educators with what's going to be happening in the very near future at COP26. So let's see. Yes, feel free to put any questions for Andrew in the chat. We're going to have some time at the end for Q&A. I think we're ready for the next slide. Okay, so curriculum resources. An hour goes by really fast, everyone, as you know, but there are a lot of great resources out there. We know it takes a lot of time to highlight those resources and kind of delve into them to see what is going to be particularly relevant. So we wanted to do some of that legwork for all of you and recommend a few things that could really help you introduce COP26 to your students. And also, some other climate change resources that would be helpful. There's definitely a lot more out there. We've just chosen a few, and you can certainly expand beyond this. But here are a few of the resources that we'd like to highlight today. So next slide. All right, so the first resource, and everything that we're highlighting here is available free on the web. I've included the website link there at the bottom for all of these different sites. And so this is from the World Wildlife Federation. They've created some really nice resources that are broken out into different age groups. Erin, if you could click on the next slide, please. And so if you clicked on, let's say, for this example, I used the 11 and older age group, there then expands into a whole list of resources, including an introduction PowerPoint for each of these different age groups. So each of the age groups will have an intro PowerPoint that is ready to plug and play for teachers about COP26. and climate change, and then additional resources that would help support different focus areas. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. Next slide, please. So for the age 11 and older, what's really nice about these resources is that they are much more heavily focused on the science of climate change. And so they do a nice overview on COP26, but they also introduce a lot of the science about climate change, what we're observing, the type of data that's being collected, and then also linking to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which I think is something that's really important when we're thinking about the global picture of climate change. Next slide, please. This is just another fun example that I wanted to show you guys for any of your colleagues who are working with younger students. This is for resources for the younger age groups, 7 to 9, and it really has a different feel to it, but it's very age appropriate. The slides for their intro presentation are definitely more, I guess, younger, designed for a younger audience, and they've done a really great job. And then they also have these really great fact sheets that aren't overwhelming, but also focus on solutions. And so one of the things that we really tried to highlight when we were choosing curriculum resources were things that also focused on solutions and ways and paths that we can move forward, rather than using scare tactics or promoting any sort of additional climate anxiety that people might have. We really want to focus on the solutions and the innovation and what types of things are already happening that can help get us to where we want to be for climate change. Next slide, Erin. Thanks. And so there's a bunch of different topic areas here that are the lesson plans. This one that I've highlighted is social justice and innovation. The lesson plans are offered through a UK-based education company called Twinkle, which I have to admit I wasn't familiar with, but they are partnering with the World Wildlife Federation and COP26 on this. The downloads are free, but you do have to sign up for a Twinkle account. I just wanted to mention that. And it's pretty painless, but the lessons from the World Wildlife Federation also have a lot of the kind of more expected categories or topics, more looking at ecology and biodiversity, oceans, but then they also add some of these more relevant and unusual topics that we haven't seen as much on, like social justice and innovation, transportation, energy, and focusing on some of the technological solutions as well. So I thought that was really, really great. Next slide, please. So that was the first one. There's a second resource here from Climate Generation. They've created a COP26 curriculum unit. And this is an educator toolkit. And this is a series of 6 activities, which is really meant for teachers to do as a whole series. And students would really become a representative of a country or a region to kind of represent through these different activities for the class. So the first activity is a jigsaw reading. They provide a bunch of different readings that are highlighting how climate change is experienced around the world. And so the student would select the reading or complete the reading for whatever region they choose or assign to, and you could do this as a group activity as well. There's a second activity, creating a story map with Google Maps, and some people have used this before. Google Maps is, or story maps are kind of a free platform that's I've used before. It's a little bit more, I don't know how to say it, but it has a slicker presentation than a PowerPoint and has a lot of really great features to it. So story maps are pretty interesting if you're interested in using those. We talked about the intended nationally determined contributions, so that investigates that a little bit. The Talanoa dialogues, this is really interesting because this is something that the United Nations adopted several years ago. And rather than just focusing on the negotiations, their goal was to encourage these open dialogues and discussions in a safe space, exploring the questions of where are we, where do we want to go, and how do we get there in relation to climate change. And so the conclusion really for this series is to have your students participate in a Talanoa dialogue, which they would represent the perspective from the country that they represent. Next slide, please. So I thought that was a really great resource. Moving away a little bit from COP26 is Our Planet, the documentary series. So of course, you know, all of us love videos and inspirational videos, especially. This is really a beautifully done series. It's a collaborative project through the World Wildlife Federation, Netflix, Silverback Films, and narrated by Sir David Attenborough. And they have a bunch of different short videos. They're grouped in different kind of topic areas here. You can see they really focus on maybe different types of land uses or different habitats that we're really familiar with. And once you click on, let's say, the high seas or fresh water, then it would open up maybe 4 to 6 short videos that are, I think they were 2 to 4 minutes or 4 to 6 minutes, pretty short. But they're really positive. They're very beautifully done. I really liked this one that I wanted to highlight here, which is A Time to Hope. And that is really what Erin was talking about, that now is the time for us to be taking action. And it's a very inspirational video, a few minutes long, narrated by Sir David Attenborough and presenting a lot of solutions and highlighting, you know, what we have at our fingertips already to combat climate change and what we just need to do more of. So I thought that was really great. Next slide, please. This is another video series, Connect for Climate. These are videos and testimonials on a wide range of different environmental topics. And I thought this one was really great because it expands upon, or I should say beyond just different habitats into different environmental sectors as well. So these are really great as well. Next slide. I'm gonna kind of speed it up because I just saw the time. Youth for Climate, this was a 9-part series that happened in the second half of last year and early part of 2021. But all of these dialogues are recorded and conversations are recorded. So these are bringing together youth from different countries and cultures to talk about a lot of different types of climate issues and how those issues are being addressed, you know, within their countries. So also a very inspirational resource there. Next slide, please. And then the Center for Sustainable and Climate Resilient Schools. This is has a little bit of a different focus. There is a curriculum component, but there's also resources here that help decision makers and administrators look at your physical campus. And so that could be a school or an institution, to look at ways that you can be adopting more sustainable practices. There's a list here of some of the different resources, and one of them that I really wanted to highlight is number 3, up-to-date information on climate change education policy here in the US. And if you're like me, it's hard to keep track of some of the changes in the movement that's happening on climate change education policy at the national level. So this is a really great resource where they're actually populating that. And from what I can see, you know, they're keeping up to date on that. So I think that's going to be one of my go-to resources here in the months to come to see how we're doing at the national level. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to share 2 videos. We don't have time to watch them today, but I think everyone recalls Amanda Gorman and her beautiful inauguration poem. And she also did a poem for, I guess it was in 2018, called Earthrise. And so I've included the link here. It's really inspirational and just a great resource, a wonderful way to bring in the arts and poetry. So I've included the link here, and then one other one, if you can go to the next slide. This is Our Climate, Our Future campaign. I really encourage everyone to take a look at this, especially if you're here joining us from, you know, like climate organization. There's a really cool campaign going on right now to create a forest of promises. And the idea is that you download these leaf templates. Your students would have, on one side, they'd write a promise to the planet, and then on the other side, a message to the leaders. And then the goal is for you to create a forest of promise, put all your leaves together, take a picture of it, and then share it on social media, which is pretty cool. Okay, I think that is it for me, Erin.
Hey, thanks, Nadia. And the last thing we'll share is that the Wild Center is actually sending a youth delegation to COP26, which we're really excited about. So there are 6 young folks attending COP and COI, including Andrew, who you got to hear from. And they are heading out, in about 2.5 weeks. And there'll be three young folks there during COI in the first part of COP, and then another 3 that come a little bit later. So these are students that have participated in our Youth Climate Summit in the Adirondacks at the Wild Center. There are folks like Andrew who've started their own Youth Climate Summit. Emma Vennard started a Youth Climate Summit in the Bronx. Silas started one at Columbia. So all these folks have amazing stories. They're accomplished climate leaders. They are all either at different colleges or recently graduated. And they're going to be attending COP and then just sharing with us their personal reflections and takeaways and reactions to what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And like Andrew said, trying to make it relevant and relatable to folks back here in the States. So we invite all of you to follow along with the delegates on our website. So just wildcenter.org/COP26. And that website is live now. You can go there and get to know the delegates, learn more about COP, connect to some of these resources. And then that website will be updated daily while the Conference of Youth and COP are happening. So that'll be the easiest place to sort of follow along daily. And then our social media will be completely taken over during that time by all of the youth delegates as well. So you can follow both the Wild Center and the Youth Climate Programs channels to hear from them on a daily basis. So definitely invite your students to follow and to tune in. Social media honestly will also be a great place to pose questions. If your students have questions, if they want to know what it's like on the ground there, that'll be a great place to reach out to the delegates to get their reactions to both what's happening at COP as well as what your students want to know.
And in the spirit of sharing more, we also at the Finger Lakes Institute and the Finger Lakes Youth Climate Summit, we are leading a social media project this fall to connect educators and students to other COP26 happenings, resources to learn about climate change and climate change action that you can undertake. And this is an effort that is being led by our new intern, Joanna Shaw. She's here today with us. She just joined our team last week. She's a senior at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and we're really excited to have her with us. So thank you, Joanna. That will be through our Instagram, and you can follow that at Finger Lakes YCS. And it will be updated pretty regularly. So we're excited about it.
Yeah, so at this point, we have a few minutes for questions. So I'm sure there's no way you could have made it through that presentation without having any questions. So feel free to put it in the chat or just to unmute yourself and ask a question if you want to. Yeah, and then there's our contact information there. If you have any follow-ups, we will be sending a recording and a link to the slide deck, which has links to all the resources in it. So you'll have that soon. But yeah, at this point, we'd love to hear any questions. Andrew is also still here. So if you have questions for him too, you can ask questions directly to him.
I don't see any questions coming through quite yet. Okay.
All right. Oh, we got one in the chat.
One. Great.
Yeah, there's a question for you, Andrew. How did you get started with climate activism?
Sure. It was through the Wild Center. I attended my freshman year. I went on a trip with a group from the Wild Center to Al Gore's climate reality training in Denver, Colorado. It was through my environmental club at my school. The president recommended that I apply to the trip and see if I could go. And I was accepted by the Wild Center. And that was such an incredible background in climate science and climate solutions. But I think the thing that stuck out to me the most was at a conference of probably 1,000 people at the lunch for youth and young people, there were probably 25 of us that were under the age of 20. And it just felt like if this is such a critical issue and something that's going to impact my generation so greatly, how come many of the best experiences out there in climate change and climate solutions aren't accessible to young people? And so that's how I really became so interested in attending the Adirondack Youth Climate Summit every year, hoping to start a summit in the central New York region to engage with other young people working in my school and community. I think that was kind of the driving motivation behind everything I have done and hopefully will continue to do. Is this idea that, climate change impacts us all, and it's a large part of the future, especially for young people. So the explanation of both science and solutions should be both accessible to and inclusive for young people.
Thanks, Andrew. And then I saw a question from Meredith too about how difficult a process is it to get accepted as a COP delegate. And I know a little bit of the process. I don't know all of it. Most of that was managed by Jen Kretzer, the Director of Climate Initiatives at the Wild Center. And from my understanding that it's a couple phases to that process. The Wild Center had to be an accredited institution or organization to even nominate delegates to apply. So that was a process that we went through. We sent folks to COP in 2015. So we had already gone through that process of becoming this accredited organization or institution. And then once we knew that we were able to send delegates this year, Jen went through the process of finding youth from our network that were interested and qualified, and then going through the process of submitting all their information to COP to apply as a delegate. So Andrew, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, just one thing, one layer that we didn't get to talk about yet, thanks, Erin, is kind of the difference between there's two different zones at COP, the green zone and the blue zone. So our delegation is badged for the blue zone, which is typically much harder to get into. And it essentially means you can go anywhere in the conference except for the negotiations that are closed door just for delegates of a certain country. However, the green zone, there are many different workshops and sessions and activities that are much more accessible. So it is much easier for both individuals and organizations that don't have the capacity to be certified for the blue zone to get into the green zone. So in general, that's a lot more accessible. And in general, the Conference of Youth is also much more accessible. It's been a little bit different this year because of COVID, but that's what I'd say.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And just what he was saying about the badging for the Blue Zone. So the Wild Center is one of 2 museums across the world at this point that are badged for the Blue Zone, which is pretty crazy, pretty exciting. I think that's all the questions at this point. Yeah, I don't see any others coming in. So I'm sure everyone's probably excited to get off Zoom. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It was great to have all of you and great to have your questions. And I just saw everything that folks were putting in the chat. I'm glad this connected with you and that you see some opportunity to use it with your students. And feel free to be in touch with Nadia or I if there's anything else we can do to help.
Yep, and be on the lookout for an email from me with a link for the presentation and also to the slide deck. And also, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.